Well, now we're going to forge ahead and expand the conversation we began in the last module about the intellectual capacities that would be required to support a religious mindset among the hunter-gatherers. And this time, we're going to look at evidence that they in fact had religious practices during the time of the hunter-gatherers. The kinds of evidence we will look at are varied. We'll start with a discussion of all things, cannibalism. Then we'll move on to a look at the symbolic use of red ochre. We will then discuss this interesting thing called deep cave exploration, and we'll look at additional evidence of religious practice among the hunter-gatherers. This will lead to a deduction of the events that led to the production of modern religions as begun by the hunter-gatherers. And then finally, we'll look at a fairly recent excavation of some archaeological evidence that supports the notion that the hunter-gatherers were the first to establish what we would consider today to be churches, a place where you go to practice religion. So with that, let's get started. So one of the interesting things that may be adduced to support the notion that hunter-gatherers engaged in religious practice was the likelihood that they were cannibalistic, at least on some occasions. And we're not talking about Jeffrey Dahmer here or any of the other notorious serial killers who killed people for fun and sport and occasionally ate them or certain body parts. That's not what we're talking about. This is cannibalistic with a much more symbolic intention. And there is a fair amount of persistent evidence that early humans, including the hunter-gatherers, were cannibalistic. And this is also supported by evidence in the current time that indigenous people, particularly the Foray people who live in Papua New Guinea, are cannibalistic. And in every case, whether ancient or modern, what we're talking about is ingestion of parts of the human brain after death. In the case of the Foray people, it made the news because as a result of ingesting parts of human brains, it turns out that there's a prion, a little organism, if you can call it that consists primarily of a strand of protein, which is very similar to the prion that causes mad cow disease in cows, but the one that the Kuru people got, the Foray people got, that is known as Kuru, was communicated to them through the ingestion of human brains contaminated with the relevant prion. And so, yet another reason not to eat brains. It sometimes has a neurological problem that can result in this prion getting into your system and causing a similar problem in you, and that's not good. But it is the case that, judging from the kinds of tool marks left on human skulls found at campsites, it appears that the hunter-gatherers were well acquainted with the business of extracting the brain after death. The likely significance is that they were eating the brains. And it's also the case that it looks like they were eating skulls that belonged to family members. The idea, they didn't eat the skull, they ate the brain. The idea was that you could perhaps capture the essence of the loved person by eating the brain. But they also ate the brains of enemies, and perhaps the motivation there was to be able to transfer the skills that the enemies had to the living, that they might prosper against those same enemies in the present, or something like that. So there was a basic notion that you could keep the spirit of the person alive in the present by eating the brain. So, as I mentioned, the evidence that we have for cannibalism is that we have found a number of sites that predate even the hunter-gatherers. We can go back to Homo erectus skulls, and there is a particular site near Beijing, or what is Beijing right now in China, that looks like cannibalism was practiced at that site, and these skulls are left as evidence that that was the case. So if you look at these skulls, they were broken open from the bottom, and this is an easy way to extract the brain from the skull. You can simply widen the foramen magnum, which is at the base of the human skull, and that's the point at which the vertebral column is inserted into the head. You can just widen that a bit and pull the brain out more or less intact. So it looks like, judging from those tool marks, which are similar to the practices used by the Fourier, for instance, in more recent times, that consumption of the brain was the goal. Other sites have shown the same kind of evidence. There's another one in Ethiopia that is more recent than the Homo erectus skulls. These skulls date back about 600,000 years ago. And again, the tool marks at the base of the skull suggest that the brains were extracted for some ritualistic purpose, like recovering the spirit of the dead person. The second practice, which suggests that religion was evolving as the hunter-gatherers came into view, was the persistent ritualistic use of this thing called red ochre. Red ochre is a soft iron oxide material, and it's kind of like chalk in the sense that if you rub it up against another surface, the dust of the red ochre would transfer to the thing you rub it upon. So in that sense, it is a lot like chalk. And you can use then the red ochre to adorn different items like pots, like weapons. Anything that is solid could be decorated with red ochre, and it would last in that form for quite a bit of time. We know that this is a fairly old practice. It predates the hunter-gatherers. It goes back at least 1 million years, where tools were deliberately colored with red ochre. At more recent campsites, hominid sites, about 100,000 years ago, there was a lot of red ochre found on tools and pots, and also evidence of the mining of red ochre. And this is really important because mining, curation of the material, storage of the material, and processing of the material for use gets to be fairly complicated. And it wasn't until the time of the hunter-gatherers that these latter skills were acquired and used routinely. And at that point, among the hunter-gatherers, it was routine to adorn things with red ochre in symbolic ways, or ways that we interpret to be symbolic in retrospect. Also, the effort given to mining and processing suggests a symbolic use rather than a utilitarian purpose, and the effort and intellectual understanding that goes into this would have been primarily found in the hunter-gatherers, who had those really big Homo sapien brains. There's quite a bit of evidence of religious worship in the Upper Paleolithic when the hunter-gatherers were alive and well. We have lots of evidence of ritualistic burial practices. For instance, 3 male bodies were uncovered in what is now the Ukraine that were elaborately adorned with thousands of ivory beads. Of course, ivory has always been a cherished commodity in societies ancient and modern, but the ability to take the ivory from its source, namely elephant tusks, and convert it into a piece of jewelry requires quite a bit of skill and some pretty fancy tools. They also used ivory in spears, and in the case of these 3 male bodies, they were interred with those spears, indicating that the people who buried the three thought they might have need of those spears in the next world. Again, indicating that there was a very vibrant belief in the afterworld and the requirement that their goods be transported with them to that world so that they could have use of them in the afterlife. In the Paleolithic, about 2/3 of graves that we've discovered contain something in the way of artifacts, jewelry, pots, other things, again indicating that there is a belief, or was a belief, that when you go to the next world, you'll have need of the utilitarian things that you used in this world, and the decorations and other evidence suggests that in addition to supplying their loved ones with the things they would need in the next world, they were also paying homage to those that they loved, who they believed would gain power in death. Another source of evidence of religious practice among the hunter-gatherers is found in the form of deep cave rituals and exploration. There are a variety of caves, many of them in Europe, that the hunter-gatherers entered, but it's clear that they did not use them to live in. For one thing, there isn't enough ambient light to provide a good shelter, nor was there any evidence of food or the utensils to make food found in these caves. So it appears that they were used for some other purpose. What might that be? Well, among the Neanderthals who were in France at this time, there are caves, deep caves, in which stalagmites were broken off and arranged into circles. Now, in these caves, there was no evidence of tools or food to suggest that they were being lived in. And again, the lack of ambient light was another indicator that that was not the intended purpose. But to go to the trouble of breaking off these stalagmites and arranging them in circles and so forth seems to be evidence that the use of these caves and the formation of the stalagmites was for some sort of ritualistic purpose, which might include the gravitation to altered states. And as time went on and the hunter-gatherers took over, the likelihood is that there was some sort of religious purpose attached to these things. We have other evidence of the evolution of religion among the hunter-gatherers, and one of those pieces of evidence is the argument and the attendant evidence that they were engaged in the production of ecstatic mental states, which would have had the ability to cement the very important social bonds that were required to keep the hunter-gatherer society together and form the basis for primordial religious practices. As we talked about last time, this ability to voluntarily enter ecstatic states is really just an extension of behavioral patterns already present in other animals, including our primate ancestors. And in those cases, it's not necessarily voluntary, and probably wasn't in most cases. Rather, the ecstatic state came about as a result of extreme stress. Could be physical stress, could be terror, emotional stress. But either way, it's a way that animals can let go of their bonds to present reality and enter some sort of altered state where they're not responsive to normal stimuli. So those precursors to genuine ecstatic states probably exist in animals and are present in the form of the release of neurochemicals which are released in response to this extreme stress, and the goal is to relieve that stress by sending the animal's mind and consciousness to some other place where it isn't tortured in the present mode by whatever is going on that's happening to that animal. So it's likely that this mechanism developed among mammals with advanced nervous systems as a way of enhancing survival by reducing unnecessary motor activity and concentrating resources towards securing that survival. You want to keep the brain alive. You can let go of many other less important functions, at least for a short period of time. You can let go of sugar metabolism. You can let go of digestion over the short term, those sorts of things. And so what the body is doing is simply redirecting all of its resources intensively to making sure that the animal survives that event, whatever it is. But humans, in addition to being able to enter these ecstatic states in the same way that animals do under great stress, we can also do it on a voluntary basis, either by purposefully inflicting great pain on ourselves or by the easier route, which is to take psychotropic drugs, which are found pretty reliably in some plants and which humans have known about for millennia. And here we have this weird combination of neurochemistry coming into conjunction with this evolving belief in the supernatural world that consists both of one's ancestors and their spirits and also the supernatural deities that were taking form during this period. A lot of people would have an entree to this experience through dreams, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. Another way of experiencing fairly regular and controllable access to that spirit world would be through trances, and that can be induced both by drugs and also ritualistic practices like rhythmic dancing. We'll talk about this more in a subsequent module. And the utilitarian view of this is that because people in trances would expect to see what others had, so there's a tendency toward achieving a consensus view of what's in that other world by the fact that, for instance, shamans and priests would have taken and probably would have preferentially been given access to those psychotropic plant materials that would cause these sort of out-of-body ritualistic experiences, and their reports would be given to the others in the tribe who had not yet experienced this. But when they did, either through great stress or through ritualistic practices like the dancing I mentioned, or if they at some point did get a hold of those psychotropic drugs, now because they'd been informed about what the priests had seen, they would expect to see the same thing. And so there would sort of be this convergence of what exists in that supernatural world, informed largely by the people who had been there first, and then creating this expectation of seeing the same thing when others take that journey. Now, the gods, when they became separate from the ancestors who had died, may have first been simply a curiosity. They may have simply reported that there's this other figure out there that has this authority and so forth. And later, as the spirits in the underworld or other world were discussed, later it appears that the god or gods began to acquire specific jobs and particular characteristics and likes and dislikes and then personalities, and they would be given, purview over certain functions on Earth. And that's how we believe that the idea that there is a god or gods with specific functions in the current world came about. Some evidence to support this is that there are a lot of religions, a lot of divine texts that are littered with dream-based prophecies. So apparently, and you can find biblical passages to support this, apparently God of various religions speaks to humanity through dreams. And of course, this capacity and this ability is largely filtered through chosen human representatives. And if you look at, for instance, the Bible, you'll find, for instance, in Judaism that Jacob dreamed of a ladder of angels ascending to heaven and Yahweh promising him the land of Israel. Another passage shows Joseph having a prophetic dream of ruling his brothers and was able to correctly interpret the Pharaoh's dreams, which gave him prominence and led to many good things that happened to Joseph. Joseph, who was the earthly father of Jesus, receives word from an angel in a dream that he is to accept his wife's pregnancy. She, of course, was, according to the text, impregnated by God Almighty. And this is just a sampling of a few examples when dreams and prophecies are delivered from the deity to humans on earth through the use of dreams that are often imbued with prophetic religious significance. We have additional evidence of spiritual practices among the hunter-gatherers specifically, gleaned from the Upper Paleolithic period, during which the hunter-gatherers, in all of their complexity, were roaming the earth. We know that they were able to exploit, as time went on, seasonally available resources, such as growing crops when they developed the correct tools, when they were able to produce their own water supply through the construction of aquifers, that sort of thing. And this would have then promoted a more sedentary lifestyle. They were able to give up their nomadic existence because they were able to cultivate their own food source locally through a lot of technological advances, such as the tools that allowed for the harvesting of seasonal crops and resources. So this caused significant changes in hunter-gatherer society, such as the idea of property ownership. If you're putting down roots, if you're developing domiciles that are built into the landscape rather than a cave or shelter that is caused by natural things like trees or caves or whatever, if you're building your own shelter and anchoring it in the ground so it can't be moved, all of a sudden the notion of property ownership took root. And because property ownership and the production of physical dwellings is something that you might want to share with your immediate family, but not more generally, all of a sudden the potential for social and economic inequity became a reality among the hunter-gatherers. And furthermore, when one dies, when one's mortality is upon you, the natural thing is to want to protect the immediate family, secure the resource you have developed during life for those to whom you are most genetically related. In addition, at the tribal level, there would be considerable interest in defense of the local area, let's say the equivalent of a hunter-gatherer town. If they were resource rich, you would want to defend them against marauding tribes from outside. And this would have religious consequences. Remember, because we had sort of a duality in the understanding of what happens in that other world. One is that it's populated by the spirits of your dead ancestors. And the second is it's populated by deities, both of which have influence over what goes on back on Earth. And as a person faces death, it would be normal for the person to want to bequeath his or her resources to direct descendants. And ancestor worship was certainly a practice that was alive and well among the hunter-gatherers, and this assured the continuation of wealth among a particular genetic lineage. There was also concern about fertility, because that too is something that's necessary to establish a lineage that will take over after your demise. So there was lots of worship for the production of resources, petitions, which we have evidence of this in modern society as well, petitions to the gods for bounty, make sure we get all the resources we need to carry on during our time on Earth, and also make sure we have enough children to keep our lineage strong and growing. So we see some of these concerns reflected in the kinds of artifacts that the hunter-gatherers left. We know that there was a concern over providing wealth because ancestors generate the wealth, but the descendants will ensure it. And that concern leads to an interest in fertility. So the kinds of evidence of that concern would be found in many, many hundreds of so-called Venus figures that have been unearthed in hunter-gatherer campsites that feature naked, often headless female forms with exaggerated breasts and buttocks and a swollen abdomen, which are taken to mean, we need to have children. Please give us many, many children. And of course, when you consider that a lot of those children are not going to make it to adulthood, the more you can produce, the better off you're going to be. Because this is related to the continuation of one's lineage after one dies. But of course, what religion is doing functionally is helping to replace the top-down hierarchy of the great apes, from which we co-descended. So, how did that get amalgamated into the egalitarian hunter-gatherer system? Recognizing that as this is playing out, they were experiencing this enormous increase in brain size, the development of tools. Some of those tools were weapons which could be used to minimize the inequities brought by males who were larger. When smaller males had really effective weapons, they were pretty much on equal footing as those more physically imposing males. Also, if the weaker males were just really smart and had the cognitive ability to pose good arguments or forge coalitions against tyrannical leaders, those would be great skills for advancing the interests of these smaller males. So we have a likely scenario in which powerful ancestors possessively guarded and bequeathed their resource-rich territories and assets to extant family members. So this is a big change from hunter-gatherer times when everybody shared equally because all of the resources were gathered communally, so all of the resources were shared communally. But now all of a sudden, with the establishment of property and the parceling out of property to individuals, now we have a great change in the way society is starting to behave. And in order to justify the departure from the egalitarian society, it would have been necessary for individuals within that society to make the argument that allowing them, those individuals, to keep their resources within their lineage wasn't selfish, it wasn't anti-egalitarian, because ultimately it benefited the entire tribe. So, if they could make the argument that it was in the interest of the entire tribe to preserve the integrity and the resource richness of those elites who had secured those resources, then we could have a way of undoing the strict egalitarianism of the hunter-gatherers. When we couple that with the reality that ancestors were viewed as causal agents who had the ability to act from afar, from the world that you go to after you die, and we imagine that there were rites associated with admitting new members to that elite status. All of these things became codified in the rituals that underwrote the religious behavior of the hunter-gatherers. So by the time of the late hunter-gatherers, the supernatural realm and its relationship to the earth was more fully fleshed out and envisioned. Religion moved from its initial focus on social bonding, which was so important to keeping the hunter-gatherers together, acting cooperatively, and moving cohesively. It changed from that to supernatural validation of those resource-holding lineages, even though that departed from the script of egalitarianism, which was so important to the hunter-gatherers because it made them successful. So the transition from the egalitarianism of the hunter-gatherers to the economically stratified late hunter-gatherers brought the need to justify that power and resource differential, and that justification, too, was sought from the supernatural world, both from the dead ancestors within the lineage and also from the supernatural deities. Now, what I have been regaling with you might be regarded by you as somewhat fanciful. How do we know all of this? We've talked about some of the evidence that have been used to deduce likely scenarios. But honestly, none of the evidence absolutely requires us to deduce that the hunter-gatherers were involved in what we would consider today to be religious practice. We can certainly imagine alternative explanations for these things. But each of the pieces of evidence that we've been talking about is consistent with the idea that the practices that we would call religious were part of the ancient hunter-gatherers. And I would note that that evidence is consistent with the practices of hunter-gatherers societies that are alive today. So, based on those strands of evidence, it's reasonable to infer that modern religious practices had ancient roots that began and were codified in the hunter-gatherer time. So what specifically are we talking about? Can we summarize this, kind of pull it together? Well, we note that the social order of the hunter-gatherers was, at least initially, fiercely egalitarian. There was no headman or chief. No one gave or took orders. And that system was aggressively maintained and had all sorts of practices and rights and expectations underscoring it because it helped them stand against constant challenges. As the brain got bigger and tools got better, you can imagine that some smart guy would emerge to challenge the existing structure. But during hunter-gatherer times, that challenge would be met with a coalition working against the upstart, returning him or her to his place, and making sure that the person who began the challenge understood that that behavior was not permissible. And this is a source of those appeasement gestures that we as humans have that allow us to broadcast to a group that we know that we've screwed up, we've transgressed, we won't do it again. Now, if we can use modern hunter-gatherers as a good example of ancient ones, we know that if the challenge persisted, the challenger would likely be outcast or killed, and we would also expect for the individuals doing the shunning or sending the member away from the tribe would likely be a member of the same family because of the fear of meting out punishment resulting in blood feuds. We know that a perennial threat to the hunter-gatherer and the cohesion of their society would be strong hunters armed with good weapons. To finesse this, the general hunter-gatherer rule was to share the hunt among everybody so that we don't have any question about whether the guy who brought in the wildebeest gets to eat the lion's share. No, he doesn't. Everybody shares equally. And this helped distinguish or extinguish bragging and stinginess because it met with great disapproval. It also helped to prevent and eliminate pride and envy and other kinds of characteristics that we consider today to be less than good. A lot of social pressure to conform was in evidence and avoid making enemies and, as a result, getting shunned or cast off. Also, we have evidence from modern hunter-gatherer societies that people with inordinately strong personalities sometimes get dealt with by accusations of sorcery. You accuse them of sorcery, and they can easily be ostracized, shunned, sent out, or even killed. But still, with the power of the alpha male taken, how would order be maintained? We've already discussed several times that if bad behavior goes unpunished, that's the most corrosive thing you can do. So, if no one would be willing to defer to anyone else, how do those group interests and egalitarian outlook how are they maintained? How do we deal with freeloaders? How do we anticipate and deal with people who take resources and don't do their share in return? It's especially important when you're living on the edge, when you're living at the subsistence level. The notion that somebody would participate in the resource distribution but not in the resource acquisition is incredibly corrosive. It really leads to the disintegration of group cohesion. So you can't let that go unpunished. If you do, morale plummets and social order breaks down. And of course, all of this would be exacerbated by the evolution of language acquisition, where people with big brains could figure out how to lie, how to deceive, how to manipulate, and how to get more than their fair share by being subversive about it. We also know that during this lengthy phase, defense of the tribe was a huge issue. We know that humans were territorial in the same sense that the other great apes are. And of course, they were eminently capable of armed defense with these wonderful tools that they were developing. We know that there was pressure, selective pressure, to suppress within group aggression. But of course, it wasn't a complete suppression. There was always things erupting within the group. We also know that between group aggression was not suppressed. In fact, that was the flip side of the coin of altruism, the ability to be very violent towards members of one's own species, but within a different tribe. We know that this kind of aggressive was liberally practiced by the hunter-gatherers, at least at the tribal level, and that prehistoric bands were estimated to have lost a high percentage of their males to war. The estimate is 0.5% of the males were lost to war, which is equivalent to 2 billion people if the tribal death rate had persisted. So among prehistoric people, about 75% of them went to war. I guess that would be primarily males, if not exclusively males. 75% went to war at least every other year. And a modern state goes to war about every 20 years. So that's a really high rate of aggression among the tribes. And their form of warfare was nothing if not horrifying. They didn't take prisoners unless they were going to torture them or eat them. They would destroy enemy encampments, leaving no resources for the survivors, including the women and children. And in that sense, the taste for combat among humans has been pretty much unbroken from our early hunter-gatherer days to contemporary man. And our ability to execute war, of course, is still evolving as our technology changes and our capacity to be lethal increases. But recall that at the same time, our positive traits such as altruism, loyalty, and duty are evolving as well. So this schizophrenic mix of traits became who we are. They co-evolved, and they are both equally important and equally in evidence in modern man. And that is because both of those traits, whether they were the positive ones like altruism or the negative traits like bellicosity, they were both shaped by similar social pressures, i.e., that is to say, the need for social cohesion to withstand between-group hostilities. Lawrence Keeley said, quote, "Warfare is ultimately not a denial of the human capacity for cooperation, but merely the most destructive expression of it." So again, the capacity for good and evil are intimately interwoven in mankind. Altruism and war are flip sides of the same coin. But as hunter-gatherer society departed from the male dominance that was so much in evidence in the other primates, they had two profound problems, which we've also addressed several times: the existence of those freeloaders and the threat of external hostile forces. How do you solve these problems? One possibility is to produce a list and codify those values that describe the things you're supposed to avoid, the negative characteristics that we don't want to see. So we don't want people to kill other people. We don't want people to lie or steal. And if we also establish a list of the positive attributes that we do want people to practice, things like altruism and thrift and cooperation and generosity, those sorts of things, then by establishing those lists, we have at least a shorthand way of explaining to ourselves and to others how we want society to be founded. But morality by itself is not enough to make sure that those values are practiced. We found that there was a moral faculty even among things like the chimpanzees and the other primates. But the evolution of religious behavior in its full-blown form, as practiced by humans, was necessary because it solved the other most vexing problems of prehistoric society that we've already addressed and discussed. It motivated the desirable social instincts. It motivated people to pay virtually any cost in defense of their own community. And it helped secure that advanced level of social cohesion required to keep the hunter-gatherers going by implanting in people's hearts and minds a new master and overseer, in addition to those dead ancestors, a supernatural god or gods. And over time, the notion that if a man wishes to be right with God, which was really important, he must also be right with his fellow man. And so there was sort of a commerce between heaven and earth in adjudicating what was proper behavior for man on earth so that he might enjoy the benefits of that rectitude when he goes to the other world, which exists beyond this one after death. The notion that he must subordinate his own interests to that of the group solved many problems, including the natural selfishness that we all have and the idea that we may be asked to be called upon to give the ultimate gift, which is the gift of our own life in defense of the group. So the supernatural overseers in the other world after death enabled hunter-gatherer society to emerge from the hegemony, the dictatorship of the alpha male that we originally shared with the other primates, and to reach this more lofty environment in which We were very explicit about the behaviors we did want to see and didn't want to see. We used language and persuasion as tools to achieve cohesion rather than force and domination, as was the case in the alpha male-dominated society. And now, in societies throughout the world, ancient and modern, gods and spirits of dead ancestors enforce rules and taboos. They punish bad behavior, both in this world and the next. They can read thoughts and punish thoughts as well as actions. This is immense power. We use the word omnipotence to describe it. That mind-reading ability gave those gods immense power. In addition, supernatural punishment meted out by the gods carries advantages for the living, particularly in prehistoric societies. No one person gets pegged and hated as the enforcer. It didn't require a legislation or a police force, which is a form of efficiency that we might employ today. The punishment may have been supernatural, beyond an evidentiary basis, not demonstrable by evidence in this world. But it did not lose its power as long as people believed it. And that's another reason for having those rites and practices that regularly, routinely reacquaint people with the doctrine to which they have pledged their allegiance and which they needed to believe so that they could be a productive and accepted member of hunter-gatherer society. So if we summarize the changes that took place during the hunter-gatherer time period, so roughly 70,000 years before present to present, this is that list as it relates to religious practice. Among pre-human members of the genus Homo and the primates, we have religion to engender social bonding and cohesion. When we get to the early hunter-gatherers, uniquely human features begin to emerge in the form of supernatural agency being given to dead ancestors and the emergence of concerns in this world about resource distribution and about fertility. By the time we get to the late hunter-gatherers, there is heightened awareness of death, resulting in existential angst, the emerging hope of an afterlife where one can go after death and continue some sort of existence. And as far as we know, there's no similar system, no cognate system in other humans, other hominids, or in primates. And then as we move on from the hunter-gatherers, we see the emergence of settled dwellings and whole societies with its attendant economic stratification and power concentration within genetic lineages. Now, let's look at a recent archaeological discovery of what appears to be perhaps the first hunter-gatherer church. This is something that was published in National Geographic in 2011, and it is drawn from the Neolithic period, so this is the period that followed the Paleolithic, and is therefore right at that point where hunter-gatherers were establishing built houses, and it would not be surprising to find that a church was part of that building process if, indeed, hunter-gatherers were involved in active religious practice. So this particular archaeological dig took place in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and appears to have been erected at the end of an ice age when the climate was becoming warmer and productive for growing and cultivating plants in situ. In other words, you could, at this point, grow plants rather than gather them. And it dates back to roughly 11,000 years ago using carbon dating techniques. Now, at this time and in this place, the discovery that we're talking about is what appears to be the erection of a temple, a building erected for specifically religious purposes. And the interesting thing about this temple is that it appears to be a temple erected without other buildings around it. So it looks as though this temple, if it's what it is, served as a mecca, as a draw from people to come from other areas where they actually lived. It might have been a monument that gave solace and comfort to travelers, people who migrated through the area looking for resources, and they could stop off at this temple to pray or engage in whatever religious practices they had. Or it could have been perhaps an initial site for the establishment of a later civilization. So the possibilities are really interesting. This is a pillar drawn from the site. You can see one big pillar here up front, another pillar in the background. You can see also how deeply they were buried and how intense the excavation must have been to get to these pillars. When they did clear the area, what they found was a ring of 20 freestanding pillars at Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey. And here's the really interesting stuff. The pillars are 18 feet in height individually. They each weigh 16 tons. Now imagine how much work, how much effort, how much manpower it would take to move pillars of that size. On the surface of those pillars, a variety of animal forms are found in bas-relief, and it is assumed that they are there for symbolic purposes. Among the creatures depicted are things like scorpions and lions, a lot of creatures that are deadly in nature, so perhaps they're there to evoke protection. And also interesting is the fact that the site is littered with flint tools, which we suppose were used in the construction of those pillars and for inscribing the pillars with the different creatures that are on them. But nothing else is found at that site to suggest that people actually lived there. And that is one of the things that gives rise to the assertion that this is probably a site for religious worship. As I said, there's no evidence that people actually lived there. There's no food, for instance. There are no pots. There are no houses nearby. And the reality is that hundreds of people would have been required to do the work that is clearly in evidence at that site. The workers would have needed homes because it would take a long time to put this together. So it appears that the workers were likely fed by hunters who brought food to the site but did not have equipment on site to either procure the food or to cook it. And as a consequence, it appears likely that the pillars were there for ceremonial purposes rather than to serve some function that was utilitarian. So the researchers asked the question whether or not this was the first site, at least that we know of, where religious practice was taking place, and did religious practice precede civilization itself, in which people started to build houses and live together in a concentrated area. And here is your study guide for evidence of religious practice among the hunter-gatherers.